Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 lecture video once again. In this video, we discuss the relationship between the long-term and short-term interest rates. So the relationship between long-term and short-term interest rates is known as term structure of interest rates. So in this graph, you can see we have yield in the vertical axis and we have bond maturity in the horizontal axis. Now, you can see these two graphs for two different time periods. This one is for year 2000 April, and this year is for September 1992. Now, if I first take this graph, you can see that it's downward sloping. So downward sloping curve is indicating that as the bond maturity increases, that means the longer the maturity of the bond, yield to maturity decreases. So there is an inverse relationship between bond maturity and yield to maturity. So that basically indicates that longer term bonds has a lower rate of return. On the other hand, in September 1992, as you see, this upward sloping curve indicating that longer the maturity of the bond, higher the yield to maturity. So it indicates that longer the maturity of the bond, higher the yield it will be offering. Okay. Now, what explains these term structures of interest rates? That means what explains the relationship between this bond maturity and yield to maturity has different theories, and it's not the scope of this course at this stage to explain all of these theories. I will just explain one theory to give you some idea that why this term structure of interest rate may be different in different time period. So one theory that states that whether long-term interest rates is higher or lower from short-term interest rate, or whether long-term and short-term interest rates are different, that depends on the demand and supply condition in the long-term bond market and in the short-term bond market. So this theory basically states that long-term fund market and short-term fund market is different. In a given point in time, if there is a higher demand for long-term fund compared to the available supply of long-term fund, in that case, the long-term interest rate will be higher. Okay? And in the short term, if the short-term fund is available, then short-term interest rates will be lower. So in that case, these curve that's called yield curve, the relationship between yield and bond maturity, it will be upward sloping, as it shows that long-term interest rate is higher than short-term interest rates. On the other hand, in a given point in time, if long-term fund is more available compared to its demand, I mean its supply is higher than its demand, and long-term interest rates is lower compared to short-term interest rates, in that case this yield curve will be downward sloping. So the downward sloping yield curve means that long-term interest rates are lower than short-term interest rates. This is one point. Another point is long-term interest rates may be lower, even another point, when investors are pretty much uncertain about the future. So they will be more willing to invest in the short-term opportunities than the long-term opportunities. Okay, so these are the different theories that explains the relationship between the yield to maturity and the time to maturity. So as you can see that in different point in time, in 1981, the yield curve was downward sloping, indicating long-term interest rates are lower than short-term interest rates. Then in 1976, sometimes it was upward sloping, and sometimes it's flat. So when it's flat, indicates that long-term and short-term interest rates are the same, and when it's upward sloping, indicates that long-term interest rates are higher than short-term interest rates. We should understand the differentiate between these three rates. One is the spot rate, forward rate, and future rate. A spot rate is the actual interest rates today. Okay. For example, if you go to check the market and you see that a 5-year bond carries an interest rate of 5%, so that's the spot rate today. Now, sometimes we become confused between forward rate and future rate. Okay. So forward rate is an interest rate that is fixed today, okay, fixed today, and this rate will be paid in future time. Okay, for example, you enter into an agreement today and you set an interest rate that is 5% that will be paid in future time. So that is the forward rate. On the other hand, future rate is the spot rate that you expect to be in future. For example, you are in time zero and you expect that the spot rate after 3 months will be 6%. So that's the future rate. Okay, so once again, the difference between forward and future rate is the future spot rate you are expecting. On the other hand, forward rate is a locked in interest rate that will be used in future. And yield to maturity, as we already discussed, is a rate of return that equates the present value of the cash flows from a bond and its initial investment. So as you already know that YTM is used to calculate the present values. And in this example, it's a $1,000 treasury bond that expires 5 years and coupon rate is 10.5%. And YTM, if market price is 107.88, is 8.5%. Okay, so this is your initial investment and this is the periodic coupon payment, and that's the coupon payment plus the principal payment. Now, if you want to know the YTM, you can simply calculate IRR. IRR, you can remember, I'm sorry, we will be discussing IRR in future time, which will be the rate that equates the present value of all these cash flows with the initial investment. So that's 8.5%.